Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Welcome to 2026. I know that's a little belated, but glad to be here with you. And I guess if there's anything that would kick off 2026 in terms of things to talk about, it's obviously what's going on in Minneapolis in particular, but in many cities with the enforcement of the immigration laws. And I've seen a whole range of opinions on X, of course. And basically, being not only a libertarian, but an anarcho-capitalist, I mean, most of them for me come from wrong assumptions about what the government is supposed to be doing, how it's supposed to be doing it. Again, as an anarcho-capitalist, at least in theory, I would like to see a private property society where life and property are protected in a free market, not by a monopolist. I mean, that is a philosophical view. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And then what we can expect in the near future and what I'd like to see in the near future regarding this. And first to this anarcho-capitalist thing. So, I've talked about that in other places. There's many books written about it, so I'm not going to try and reconstruct the theory here other than to say that anarcho-capitalists do not believe in a lawless society where you could do whatever you want. They believe in a private property society where private firms or individuals, but more likely private firms competing in a market would secure our property. And someone might say, well, what about your life and your liberty? Well, those are property rights. And I guess that's the first thing. I said basically what I've said right here is I'm an anarcho-capitalist, but on X, and somebody posted, if someone could wave a magic wand and there would be an anarcho-capitalist system, there would be a government the next day. And I do agree with that, actually. If somebody waved a magic wand today, and poof, there's an anarcho-capitalist system, there would be a government the next morning or very soon after, as soon as people could get together and form one. Does that mean the idea can't work? No. It means the idea can't work with the present principles that are shared by most of society. So, the majority doesn't determine our rights. Our rights exist regardless if the rest of society doesn't want to respect them. But the majority does pretty much decide whether our rights are going to be respected. That's an unfortunate rule of nature, is that the strongest will impose their will, and the greater numbers, of course, are always the strongest, unless you got your own nukes or something like that. So, in order to ever get to this society that I theoretically think is probably the best society for humanity to live within, a massive sea change in political principles would have to occur that not only took Americans back to the ideas they were thinking in the early 19th century, late 18th century, the classical liberal ideas, but even beyond those. But the seeds of anarcho-capitalism are in the Enlightenment and in the classical liberal period. And I say that because it comes down to, while they thought there should be a government, what the government was supposed to be doing to them is much different from what the vast majority of people in the United States think the government is supposed to be doing today. Okay, so and when you say government, okay, you could even say in an anarcho-capitalist system, there would be government. People would be governed. But not by a monopolist entity. Okay. In other words, there would be certain reasons that most people agreed that force should be used against other people. Okay. Because that's really the question. When you say, what should the government be doing? You're really saying, when should force be used with impunity? When can someone initiate force against somebody who isn't attacking them? Okay. And the classical liberal Enlightenment answer is when they have committed a previous violation of property rights. And that's the only time. So you want to think about that for a minute. Really? That's the only time that they thought, yeah, yes. I mean, if you read John Locke, whom Jefferson said you had to read to understand American liberty and natural rights, either in nature or society, and you read all the people who kind of followed in his footsteps. I mean, there's not much new ground broken in the classical liberal tradition after Locke's second treatise. That's my position. Until I guess you get to Murray Rothbard, and he's not the first, of course, Lysander Spooner, lots of people in the anarchist tradition, but not all of the anarchist tradition, because some of that was communist. So those anarchists who believed in private property broke some new ground by saying, look, not only is the only time that force is justified, initiation of force, in response to a previous violation of property rights, but that it is an initiation of force to form a government that does not meet that stand. In other words, every individual has a right to choose the mode of protection for his property and to for the majority and other people to form this monopolist entity and then force even the minority or the more minority of one even to pay for it, to live under its laws, is itself a violation of the principle. Okay, and in theory, that's correct. So people will say, well, that's not practical. Well, it hasn't been practical so far because not enough people have gotten on board with it, but they did get on board with limiting the government so much that it only responded to previous violations of property rights. Now, of course, that was the idea of the classical liberal government. And that's what Jefferson said in his first inaugural. We need a government to keep us from injuring each other and otherwise leave us free. And that was actually called out by Woodrow Wilson in his campaign speeches that were collected into a book called The New Freedom, where he said, hey, we used to say in Jefferson's time, the government should only do that. But now we can't do that anymore. Now, he campaigned on that and he won. So that's really kind of a turning point in not just because Woodrow Wilson said it or thought it, but because he was able to win two elections campaigning on those ideas. That old classical liberal, some call it the night watchman state, is no longer good enough for this complex world. Now, I think that's complete hogwash. Of course, there were always people saying life is too complicated to have the government limited to this. We just happen to have, an industrial revolution and complete transformation of society, lifting, the working class out of poverty. All happened under a government that at least said they were trying to do those things. Now, of course, by the time you get to the Republicans in the second half of the 19th century, they're starting to introduce all kinds of corruption interventions into this. But the basic principle was still there. And so, our Declaration of Independence says, what's the purpose of government? To secure these rights, period. And the Constitution's long preamble in Madison's verbose, imprecise, rambling style lists some more things, but they basically all come down to the same thing, to defend people against violation of their property. And again, I keep coming to this word property. Life and liberty are property rights. If you read Locke's Second Treatise, and I wrote a whole article called You Have a Right to What You Own and Nothing More, you understand this. And that really is what it is, that property is the central issue. Your right to life is based on the fact that you own yourself. Your right to liberty is based on the fact that you own yourself. And then that naturally extends to the right to keep the fruits of your labor, because your labor is part of your life. You're alive during that time you're working. And if you invest your labor into materials or just a service, then you have a right to keep whatever anyone exchanges with you for that. Or you have a right to keep the product you made directly out of nature from. That's just an extension of self-ownership. Okay. And from these principles, you can derive, things like the free market is just a respecting of property rights, because once you own something, you have the right to dispose of it as you see fit. So, some people have formal definitions of ownership, like possession, title, and disposal. Okay. Possession meaning you have the thing, title meaning other people recognize that it is yours, and disposal meaning you can do whatever you want with it as long as you don't violate the property rights of anybody else. Okay, so that there requires a laissez-faire free market. There's no intervention that does not violate that property right, including tariffs, including wealth redistribution, including Social Security, including like 80% of what all governments do, which is just taking money from one person and giving it to another. Originally, the government was supposed to make sure that didn't happen. That's what they're supposed to be preventing, not perpetrating. Okay. So I say all ties directly into what I'm going to say about immigration, because if you don't accept an anarcho-capitalist society, then you accept some kind of government. And even if you accept in principle the government that the Declaration of Independence posits, one that is limited to securing your rights, then, okay, well, how do we secure the rights? We're going to elect a legislature and they're going to pass a whole bunch of laws and we have to follow them. And supposedly these laws would all be to the end of securing your rights. Now, again, as I just said, most of them are not, but consenting to the government means that you have to follow the laws. All right. And you could say the immigration laws are one of those laws that violate the rights of the people trying to immigrate, because they have every right, as long as they don't trespass on anyone else's property, then they should be able to, peacefully move inside our borders and, work and make a living, and they're here to get a better life and whatever. And again, in theory, that I agree with that. I do agree with that. So the question is, are they trespassing if they're on public property? I'm going to do a separate podcast on this, but I would say, no, that's where the error is made. They are trespassing. That in fact, we do own, I'll explain this in more detail, but the people of the United States, whether they like it or not, own the land that is called public property, either the people of the United States or the people of the separate states, or even in some cases, I think there's some county land and county roads and et cetera, maybe even town in some cases. So in every inch of land in the United States is owned by United States citizens of some denomination. Now, some land is not owned by all of them, just the people in a particular state, etc. Now, again, speaking for myself, I don't want to own anything but the 5 acres of land that I have a title to. I want no part of the rest of it. I don't want to pay for it. I don't want to make laws about it and decide who's on it and who's not at all. But I don't have a choice. Okay. So this land of the free is imposed on me. I have to own it. I am forced at gunpoint to own it for it, at least to pay for its upkeep. Okay, as far away as Seattle, Washington, I some of my money goes to maintain their roads. Now, the bulk of that is the state, but federal money goes for that. And I don't want to be involved in that, but I'm forced to be. So then we get down to, okay, if this was a private property society, now no one person would own, let's say, Seattle, or let's just say Minneapolis, because that's where all the recent trouble has been. It would be owned by many people. And if there was a large block of land owned by more than one person, just like a business partnership, what do business partners do when, they want to decide to do something? They take a vote among the members. Now, the votes aren't always equal. Like I was in a partnership where I only owned 10% of the company. And the guy who put in most of the money owned, I think it was 75%. Then there were two partners that put in less money, and then I put in the least. And so, of course, his vote was the only vote. All right. But in some partnerships, it's not so clear. There isn't a majority owner. Most small businesses, there is, but in larger businesses, there aren't. Now, in big, huge corporations that are publicly traded, again, you may have a very large shareholder, but you have shareholder votes on what's going to happen with the board, with the CEO. He can be fired by the board at the request of the shareholders. So, in other words, when there's joint ownership, there's always some kind of vote. Okay. We have this egalitarian system in the United States where that hasn't always been there, by the way. I mean, early in the Republic, you had to own a certain amount of property to even have the right to vote. Yes, even if you were a white man, you needed to own a certain amount of property to be able to vote. And the idea was we can't have people with no skin in the game just voting themselves a share of other people's property. That's why the United States wasn't a democracy. That's why you don't find the word democracy anywhere in any document, because a republic does not automatically mean universal suffrage and all the votes are counted equal. Absolutely not. And this was something that, varied over time, varied from state to state and parts of the country to other parts of the country. It's something that the founding generation and the next few generations kind of wrestled with. How do we protect everyone's property and still not impose a government on somebody who has no vote in it at all? Okay, so eventually they ended up with the idea everybody should vote. I don't think that's turned out so well. Okay, but not if your standard is preservation of property, life, liberty, and your justly acquired possessions, then everybody voting has been a disaster. And it was much better when you had to have a certain amount of property. And I don't just mean land. I mean, and it wasn't just land. You had to demonstrate kind of a net worth of a certain amount. It couldn't be all gold for some of those early states, even in the colonial system where there was voting, we had variations there. So if the whole United States is owned by all or some of the people, if some of the United States, federal land is owned by the whole body of people of the United States, and so the state land in Minnesota is owned by the people who, the state voters of Minnesota, And then, I don't know in the Twin Cities, if there's county land or whatever, you get the picture. Then the way that decisions are made about who can be on that property are unfortunately made by elected representatives to pass laws. That's it's not like one person can override the wishes of all the other owners, just like in a business. One person can't override all the other owners unless that person has a majority of the shares of the company. Okay, so that's the system. I don't like it. I don't want it. I want no part of owning any part of Minnesota at all, or even any part of New York, again, outside of my 5 acres. But I'm forced to. And then they also force upon me the rules of the game. And the rules of the game are elected representatives make the laws. Now, and they say, and the laws say you can't come in the United States unless you fill out what I can only imagine is a blizzard of forms and who knows what else you have to do. I've never immigrated to the United States, but I can imagine it's a nightmare, just like the DMV, probably worse. Okay. And there's some people they just won't let in arbitrarily or whatever. Okay. That's the reality. Now, there's the whole question of, well, why is the federal government telling Minneapolis, or I should say Minnesota, who can come in their state? Well, as I've written as early as 8 or 10 years ago, that's just another Supreme Court decision, just as nutty as Roe versus Wade, just as spurious, where the one day they just decided this is a federal power. Because before that, the states were doing it. So strictly speaking, there's been no amendment. And if you read Chai Lung versus Freeman, you'll see how idiotic that Supreme Court decision was based on nothing. They don't even argue it's granted in the Constitution. They basically argue it would be bad if it wasn't a federal power, so it is, which is not how the delegation of powers works, to make a long story short. So, we should have a state immigration system, and then Minnesota could let in as many people from the third world as they want, and they could reap the consequences. And then, you know, Alabama could kick out as many people as they want and reap the consequences of that. But we don't have that system. So the feds are in charge of it, illegitimately, in my opinion. And I'll post a link to that article on the show notes page. So basically, we have a system of limited government that almost nobody wants to get rid of. And again, the limited part, I should put up the air quotes for those watching and not just listening. It's the limited part is almost laughable at this point. But in theory, we have this government, and the federal government makes the laws about who can cross the outside the border states' borders. Okay. So who can cross Florida? I'm going to leave some out. Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, Arizona, California, New Mexico, and whatever, all the states on the north. Okay. Who can cross those borders into those states is decided by the federal government, mainly because of this decision called Chai Lung versus Freedom, and then a bunch of other ones that followed, but kind of just reinforced that this is a federal power. Now, as early or as recently, what is this, 2025, as 2021, or I should say as recently as 2023, 2024. What am I saying? I don't know what year it is. No, okay. As recently as last year, the Democrats had the power to change the immigration laws, and they didn't do it. Now, there is a minority in the Democratic Party who thinks that we should just not have immigration laws, abolish ICE. ICE is just the enforcement of the laws. So you could want to abolish ICE and still have the laws. But they say they want open borders. But you know what? It's not even a majority of the Democratic Party, much less of the whole country. And, again, the system that's imposed on us has these rules about how we're supposed to dispose of the land that we own against our will or regardless of our will. And the laws say, blah, 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 fill out these forms, stand in line, wait for years, whatever they say. I'm sure it's ridiculous. And if you don't do that, we're going to kick you out. Okay. I don't really have a say in that. Okay. I don't even like the whole system. So, you know, don't blame me. I voted for Ron Paul. But in any case, that brings us to all right. Once you accept that you have a government and this government can make laws that legitimately you have to govern you, you have to obey. You don't have a choice. Well, you don't have a choice. Or why don't you have? What if you don't follow the laws? Well, the government is going to use force against you. This brings us back to the beginning of our conversation. That's why they call it law enforcement. See that? How there that word force is in there? Force means violence. They are going to use violence against you if you don't comply. Now, you know, if you get a park in the wrong place, they're not going to come tackle you. They're going to leave something on your car. But if you don't send in your $50 or whatever it costs these days for a parking ticket, I haven't had one of those in a while, then eventually they're going to issue a warrant they call a bench warrant from a judge, and some guys with guns are going to come get you. And even over this parking ticket, if you don't go along, they're going to force you to go along. Now, for most people, if they twist your arm a little behind your back, they're going to cuff you and drag you into the car, even if you're putting up a little bit of a resistance. But the more you resist, the more force they're going to use. And if you use enough, they're going to kill you. And that's actually how the system is supposed to work. That's why they call it law enforcement. All right. So, again, most people, it's like, they come to arrest you for something. By the time you get to them actually taking you into custody, that could be like a DUI, and those people might resist in their impaired state. And some of them, I'm sure, do. But at the end of the day, there's no scenario where once they place you under arrest, you're going to resist enough where they're just going to let you go. Now, you could get away, theoretically. Some people could run faster than the cops. But if you get away from two of them, they're going to send 10. And if, you struggle against 10, they'll send 20 if they have to. They'll send 1,000 if they have to. That's the reality there is no scenario where you can resist an arrest. And, you know what? We took another look at it. Let's call it quits. It's not going to happen. Even if it turns out you weren't guilty of the crime and maybe your lawyer gets you off on that, they're still probably going to charge you with resisting arrest. Okay. And, then it comes down to, okay, if you resist enough where you put the officers in danger, then they have a right to kill you. Now, it used to be that even if you ran away, they'd shoot at you. If you watch the old black and white movies, you'll see that they didn't always have this standard where the officer had to feel his life was in danger. If you were placed under arrest, you're supposed to give yourself up. That's the way the system works. And then they have a court that's supposedly, impartial, that's going to decide if you were really guilty or not. So you have nothing to worry about. If you get put under arrest, you're going to have your day in court. Now, of course, we know this is all gibberish, but that's the system. Okay. That's the one that everybody endorses. If they didn't endorse it, they'd elect representatives who would get rid of it, or at least, get rid of the laws they don't like. We've had the same immigration system for all of my life. They actually passed the last immigration bill. I mean, there's been little bills here and there, but the general system, the year I was born. So 60 years, I'm sorry. Oy. So yeah, for 60 years. All right. We've had Republicans and Democrats each have multiple chances with having, the White House, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, all their party controlled, and no one's repealed that 65 bill, and nobody has repealed the other, immigration laws. Nobody's made it open borders. So for 60 years, if the people, democracy at work, wanted to change in substance the immigration laws, they would have. They haven't. All right. Again, does that have any, thing to do with your rights as an individual or mine? No, but that's the system that everybody wants. Everyone keeps endorsing, including the Democratic Party. So, I mean, the whole idea of resisting ICE for them is ludicrous. It's childish because this is the system that you've created with your democracy. And we're much closer to a democracy now than we were 200 years ago. So if this is what you want, I mean, you can't have laws and then not enforce them, right? So, so the whole idea that there shouldn't be officers enforcing the laws is stupid. It's gibberish. Now, are they using excessive force? So this is, down to a case by case basis. They will argue about the lady who got shot in her car while she was driving away and, bumped the police officer. And, certainly with a shot through the windshield, it's hard to say that there wasn't some danger to the police officer. Now, he ended up walking away from that. No one's ever going to agree on that. Excessive force, maybe. Not excessive. I'm sure if I got a room, I actually know a whole bunch of border agents. I used to train with them in martial arts. And I'm sure if I got all them together and said, tell me about why a cop's got to be so worried if a vehicle tries to pull away, even if it doesn't try to hit them, they'd come up with a bunch of officer deaths or regular police officers would say, oh, well, in our training video, they showed us this guy get killed, that guy get killed. I know a guy who got killed. And supposedly the driver was just trying to get away. Okay. And then I guess we have another one now where the guy's on the ground and they've got his arms or at least one of his arms behind his back. And you're like, well, why the hell would they shoot him? Well, they were still unable to cuff him. Okay. So again, you might say big, strong police officers, come on, he's on his stomach, at least one hand's behind his back. How could you have to kill him? And I'm sure you get a bunch of cops, like I said, and they're going to come up with, yeah, we had this guy on the ground, we had this guy on the ground, we had this guy on the ground. Now, out of the millions of interactions that happen every day, these are a very small percentage. Police shootings are a very small percentage. I mean, they kill like 400 people a year. Okay, there's like 600,000 law enforcement officers on the streets at any given time. And, if 100,000 of them pretend cops like IRS agents who still carry guns for some reason, then, let's just call it 500,000. If those officers interact on average with 2 people a day, you're talking about 1 million interactions a day and 400 killings per year, justified and unjustified, total. So you're talking about a tiny percentage of all interactions end up like this. You can debate whether or not excessive force was used on this or that occasion, but you can't debate that force was used if there's any resistance at all. I mean, because that's the idea. I mean, that's the idea of having a government, is to initiate force against people who have broken the government's laws. So all this, it's all kind of ties together. The idea of what's constitutional and not all has to do with, is that law something that people agreed to or not? Because if it doesn't exercise a power delegated in the Constitution, and I'm talking strictly of federal law here, then that's not a valid law. That's where the whole idea of interposition came in, of nullification. We don't recognize that as a valid law. It's not exercising a power that was given to the federal government. So, the state government's going to get in between this individual victim and the federal government. That was the idea of nullification. Now, you should remember state laws, there is no delegated powers. They have the power to do anything they want as long as it doesn't violate the state Bill of Rights. And then we've muddied all that with the incorporation doctrine that the federal Bill of Rights somehow applies even to state governments and local ones. That's a subject for another day. But in any case, the states, I mean, they could pass whatever they want, basically, especially since they watered down all those state bills of rights or just ignored them. But dealing specifically with the federal government, I mean, again, to me, every immigration law is unconstitutional. The idea of sanctuary cities should really be sanctuary states because it is a state power. And it's not like this is a theory. Chai Long versus Freeman, the court case that gave it to the federal government, Chai Long was a Chinese immigrant and Freeman was the California state immigration officer. Okay, the states were enforcing immigration laws at the time that the feds took it over, the same way they've taken over so many other things that are unconstitutional. All right. But again, almost nobody agrees with that, even though it's true. Nobody recognizes that. Okay. The vast majority of people believe this is a federal government power. They have a Supreme Court case, however spurious, to back it up. And the only disagreement really seems to be whether the laws should be enforced or not and how strictly. That's it. So, like, if you believe in the governmental system at all, you should believe they should be enforced 100% or they should be repealed through the process of legislation. So, it comes down to, I think some of these ICE guys are amped up. And here's the thing. The people out there screaming and blowing whistles at them, even before they even touch anybody, are just awful people. They're awful. You believe me, most of you would not like these people, wouldn't want to be around them. That doesn't mean they don't have rights, but they're really awful and they're unrelenting. They're the same people that burned down cities during the whole George Floyd fiasco. All right. And they're mostly communists or at least socialists. I mean, when they march, and they never report this, but if you get a picture of the march, there's all this anti-capitalist, all the signs, capitalism, blah, 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 blah. All right. So they're violent, unsavory, communist, just awful from beginning to end, at least politically. I mean, some of them might be very nice people to their next door neighbors. And so you have that in your face all day. And these guys are, amped up with Trump saying we're going to get tough on immigration. And people are trying to keep them from enforcing the law and trying to get violence committed against them. So I think they're probably responding differently than they would if it was just, like a DUI stop in most cases, or, the normal course of apprehending someone who's broken the law. Now, if it's a violent crime, violent criminals often resist arrest. And they often get shot when they resist enough where the officer feels endangered. Do some officers shoot when they really don't feel in danger, but just think they can get away with it? Probably. I don't know. Again, there's not that many shootings. 400 out of a million a day. So at least 365 million interactions. That's assuming 2 per day for each officer, which I think is probably low. So, we're talking about a very small percentage. So, and I think, another aspect of our society that's somewhat broken down is how much emotion informs our political decisions. I mean, when you hear these people out there reacting to ICE, and again, I'm not talking about when they got a guy on the ground and they're batoning him. I'm talking about they're driving down the street or they may be on their way to some place where they're going to do whatever they're going to do. And these people are screaming like possessed people. What's wrong with you? How do you live with yourself? Again, they have every right to do, but this is not a person who's making a political decision based on reason. All right. It's extremely emotionally invested in this issue, as right wingers are in enforcing immigration, okay, which is leading to this violent clash. You've got extreme emotion informing everybody and no reason. It's no accident that the free society was born in what they call the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment. Technically two different periods, but forget it, I'm rolling. That it was all based on reason. The right wingers will say it was all born out of Christianity, but really, Christianity dominated the Middle Ages. And what set the Enlightenment apart was people starting to question with boldness even the existence of a God, as Thomas Jefferson said. And, John Locke and he and others were deists who believe there's something out there, but for the most part, it doesn't interfere with the daily workings of the world, and that you could derive our natural rights purely from observation. They are self-evident. It's a very tricky statement, and this is a separate topic altogether too, so I won't ramble too long on it. Endowed by their creator, it is self-evident that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Well, if it's self-evident and you turn out to be wrong about the creator, the source, it's still self-evident. And that whole phraseology comes right out of John Locke, who said that all being equal and independent in the state of nature, there is nothing more evident that, and so on and so forth. So that's where they got that word, self-evident. I mean, Jefferson was channeling Locke in that little phrase. He later tried to make himself look smarter by saying, oh, I just had the idea of drawing on all the truth in the world or whatever. But right before he died, he said, listen, we have this state university. If we're going to be teaching any political principles, you better teach Locke's second treatise if you want people to understand liberty and natural rights. Actually wrote up a resolution for the Board of Governors of the State University of Virginia. So, and then where I'm coming down on this is, look, if you're resisting at all, you're not going along with the system that you say you want, and especially the left-wing Minnesotans who are mostly socialists and want the government in charge of everything. Okay. I mean, the right wingers pretty much do too. They just believe that they don't. At least they think they don't. No, the left wingers know they want the government in charge of everything. For you to then say, well, I don't want you to enforce these laws, it just doesn't make any sense. And again, I mean, they don't make any arguments either. They're not hurting anybody. Well, you don't want that system. In fact, your champion, Woodrow Wilson, said, we can't have that system anymore. And you elected him twice, and you hold him up as a hero, and you keep electing people who believe the same thing. So if you want a government that keeps us from injuring each other and otherwise leaves us free, then you want to join the Libertarian Party. And of course, you don't want the accountability that comes along with a free society, with private property, with inconvenience for you of respecting the rights of others. You don't want that. So he's not hurting anybody is not a defense for a left winger or a right winger, really. Sometimes they like to sound like libertarians. A few of them are. I mean, Rand Paul's a libertarian. Thomas Massey's even more libertarian. But these people aren't right wingers. They just happen to run in the Republican Party so they can get elected. But for the most part, and again, I've done a whole book and many podcasts, but liberty and property, but I repeat myself, are not the priorities for conservatives. Order is. The suppressing of man's savage instincts. Okay? What they agree, some liberty should be allowed, but only when it doesn't interfere with that. And really, it's kind of a weird principle because, you could have, once you have real disorder, you're invading someone else's property rights. If you're not, you should be left alone. But, the right wingers feel like you've got to interfere with property rights or you will not be able to suppress the animal side of mankind. So that's where they differ from libertarians. They also believe in private property, but under all these rules and only so much as it doesn't interfere with, again, keeping order. Now, the left wing, again, property, they reject the idea of private property at its core. I mean, their intellectual father, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, said that's the beginning of all society's problems, private property. And that the purpose of government is to fix the inequality that arises from private property. So inequality is the problem for the left wing. So again, they believe in enough liberty. They believe in like a libertine kind of liberty where you can do whatever you want except keep the fruits of your labor, except when you're working. If that half or more of all your waking hours when you're at work, they don't believe you have any liberty then. Not even to pick the price of what you sell your labor for. They think they can impose that on you. So we really, I mean, I'd say libertarians might be 2% of the population. They used to win landslides. I mean, the country was founded as a libertarian country. There is no argument on that. And it slowly devolved into first a conservative and then a socialist country. But for a long time, it was a libertarian country. But now 2, maybe 4% of the population believes in the libertarian principles. And the rest, you don't like the laws, change them. Why haven't the Republicans repealed the 1965 Immigration Act? Why not? They could do it in one day. Repeal it. I mean, they couldn't do it now, but they could have done it, or they could do it now, actually. I think you get some pushback from some Republicans, but Bush had both houses in the White House. This has happened more than once since the immigration law was passed. Why has nobody repealed it? Because nobody wants to repeal it. And it's only a minority who objects to the system that's there now. It was, obviously it passed both houses back then and was signed in 1965 by Lyndon Johnson, but it could have been repealed. It could have been repealed in 2001, 2002, 2003. It could be repealed right now. So, I guess I'll cap it off by saying the system that most people say they want says when they come to arrest you, you just give yourself up. And then if you physically resist, you're doing so against armed people at the risk of your life. I see all these memes with like the founding fathers and, stop resisting like this is a gotcha. Yeah, the British government sent tens of thousands of troops to kill those people. Okay, if you're ready for that, have at it, my friend. I mean, since most people don't want my system of government, Jefferson's at the very least, I want no part of it. But you want to do an armed rebellion, good luck. Lots of luck. And especially for the rest of us if you win, for the most part. But I want no part of that. I want no part of the system we have. But the only way we're going to get even back to a classical liberal system, anarcho-capitalism light, is a sea change in the minds of the people. And at the center of that is the idea of property. And until people again have an understanding that the only rights they have are property rights and that they have to respect the property rights of other people, we're never going to get a system like that. We seem to get farther from it every year. Certainly the whole Trump thing was not a movement in that direction. So, I mean, when we were talking like carving out large parts of the government and getting rid of them, okay, that talk was something like in that direction. Although even the principle there was not, we don't need the government to be more efficient. We need it to do different things or to stop doing most of the things it does, not just do them more efficiently. So even that was just terribly flawed. And it seems like it was never serious, or if it was, it doesn't matter. Most Americans do not think that the government should enforce everybody's property rights. And until they do, we're never going to have a free society again. So on this immigration thing, I'm sure, maybe the guy that was on his stomach, that was excessive force. I'm sure we haven't seen the whole story. And guess what? The government gets to decide whether it was too forceful or not. All right. So again, lots of luck with that in the system. I'm sure he'll have some lawyers for the family suing, and maybe they'll win. And I don't have all the facts. I've, as usual, seen a clip when the guy's already on the ground. He's already still struggling at that point. It seems ridiculous to shoot him. I don't know what happened in that scrum where the officers back away and shoot the guy. Whatever. It looks bad. Probably was bad. Might not have been bad. I don't know. But the system that most Americans say they want say he should have been arrested and that he should have given himself up and tried his luck in the courts. What more can I say? And with that, I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.
The War of Ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.